right, so our main speaker today, we're going to go right into it, guys. Dr. Christina Hughes from the University of Houston. Dr. Hughes has 15 years teaching experience and has taught over 13 different courses within the discipline of political science. She has also served as a research associate for the Hobby Center of Public Policy from 2000 to 2006, working on 2 separate grants with a combined value of $1.8 million. She also served as the principal investigator on an evaluation of learning signature for Cy-Fair Community College. And today she's going to be here to talk to us a little bit about the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, is my understanding. So let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Christina Hughes.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can,
okay,
yeah.
Great, okay. One correction, I'm at the University of Houston downtown now.
Oh, that's right, I'm sorry. So I was a U of H grad myself, and I get them confused.
I was at University of Houston a long time, but I'm at UHD now. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about factions and how we got here today in our Constitution, I guess. So every political philosopher throughout time has tried to figure out how do you control factions, because factions are what will basically bring the end to any regime. So in modern time, we basically have 2 models of democracy, a consensus model and a majoritarian model. So majoritarian model is what we have in the United States, although accidentally. So majoritarian model is based kind of on Locke's theories of democracy. His idea was the only way to get rid of the king or the sovereign is to have a civil war. So he was very pragmatic, and he thought, you know, why don't we forego killing each other and we replace that with elections? So a ballot is basically just a symbolic bullet. So we'll just count up the swords or count up the bullets instead of actually like shooting each other. And in the early days of British Parliament, that's actually how they took votes. They unsheathed their swords and held them up, and they would count them, and the sides with the most swords won. So it's simple majority gets their way. But Rousseau, he wanted something more than that, because what if the majority is only 51%? Then you have 49% of the population who's still not getting what they want. And it's not only is it not fair, but it's very factional, and it's very, you can have a very small majority, like basically dictating life for a large minority. And so he wanted more of a consensus model. So he comes up with this idea of the general will, although he doesn't actually tell us how to get there. But his idea was general will is very different than the particular will. Particular will is just like what I want the government to do for me, what policies I want. And that's my particular will. He says, but the particular will is not good because we're selfish, and we don't always know what's best for us, and we want what's good for us, which can cause a lot of harm to everybody else. So he says, what you really need is the general will. So the way that you get the general will is you take all the particular wills, you add them up, you subtract the pluses and minuses, and that's the general will. So basically for him, the general will is the mean position, the most moderate position of everybody. So you take that, if you think of a bell curve, you take that right in the middle of the bell curve, that's the general will. So that's a consensus model. So a good example of the majoritarian model is England, Great Britain. So they have a parliamentary system where majority rules. The prime minister is chosen by the members of parliament, the majority members of parliament, and he's the head of government. It only takes 51% of parliament to make all policy. They don't have a written constitution in England, so basically that makes parliament sovereign, and whatever they say is the law of the land is the law of the land. Anytime the prime minister can't get 51% of parliament to vote with him, he can call for a snap election and get a new parliament, which is what Boris Johnson did in order to get Brexit passed. At the same time, anytime parliament loses confidence in the prime minister, they can do a vote of no confidence, which also calls for new elections, and they can get a new prime minister. But the majority rules. Most other democracies in Europe have a consensus model. So a consensus model is when your government is not ruled by just one party, but by a coalition of parties. So basically in consensus models, you will have proportional representation. So a party's seats in parliament is determined by the percentage of votes that they receive. So if you have 30% of the votes, you get 30% of the seats. And since it's not likely that one party will get 51% of the vote, in the end, after all the votes are cast, multiple parties have to basically join into a coalition with each other and agree to govern, which means that there's no one clear majority, and all the minorities basically have to agree on what they want the policies to be. And it keeps factions kind of under control. So in our own Constitution, Madison, who wrote our Constitution, he was trying to figure out how to control factions, because he knew that factions could basically cause the United States to not last. And so he comes up with checks and balances, which we've all heard every year growing up in school, checks and balances, but no one really explains what that means. So it's twofold. So the check is actually, I know we always hear, oh, it's separation of powers, but it's actually veto players. The more veto players you have, the larger the majority has to be before policy change can occur. And so we have in the United States, basically we have 4 hard veto players. So we have the House, the Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court. So since all legislation has to go through both the House and the Senate, each of them has a veto on each other, and then the President can veto that, and then the Supreme Court can declare a law unconstitutional, so that's another veto. So those are 4 hard veto players. But on top of that, we have a soft veto player in federalism. So basically the states can just choose to ignore a law passed by Congress, and that's kind of a soft veto because they're in a game of chicken with Congress. Like, we're not going to enforce this law for you. You're going to have to take us to court and make us do it. So that's another way of like slowing policy down. On top of that, it takes a super majority not only to get laws passed, but a super majority to change the Constitution. Because in the United States, it's really the Constitution that's sovereign, not anybody else. And so you have to have that super majority to change the Constitution. It's very hard to do. It's happened very few times. And so this was kind of like the first way we were going to keep a check on one faction having too much control over government, to make sure that the rights of the minority are protected, to make sure that the policies that are passed don't just benefit a small group, don't just benefit the majority, but benefit the country as a whole. The second way it works, the balance part, is that each one of those veto players basically has to represent a different constituency. And so in the beginning, you have the House, which is the only branch that's was elected directly by the people. And so the way that Madison controlled that in Federalist Number 10, he talks about it's really important that the district size for the congressional districts is really, really large and spread out over a large geographic space. And he says, so the Constitution says each congressional district has to represent at least 30,000 people, which doesn't sound like a lot now, but in 1787, that would have been spread out over a really large geographic area. Because the idea was the person who was running for that congressional seat, the only way he could win would be to appeal to the most moderate position. The extremes, they don't get their positions heard. They get washed out because he has to run to the middle in order to be elected to office. So the most moderate position gets elected. And that was in the House. Then in the Senate, originally they weren't directly elected. They were appointed by the state legislatures. So they would be even further removed from the people, but they were thought to be even more moderate. And then the president elected by the Electoral College was even further removed, because in the beginning, the way the president and the vice president were elected is the Electoral College would be chosen by the state legislators with no set agenda of who they were going to elect. They would meet, they would vote, and the person who got the most votes would become president, and the person who got the second most votes would become vice president, always ensuring that basically your president and vice president would represent the two different factions in the country, so that no one faction could have too much control. So over time, we made changes. We first had the 17th Amendment, which allowed for the direct election of the senators. And we've completely changed the way we do the Electoral College now, and that we go and vote for members of the Electoral College, and then it's winner take all. So if you get 51% of the vote in the state, you get all of the Electoral College votes of the state. So as we saw in the last election, and we saw in 2000 as well, it is possible to lose the popular vote, but still get the Electoral College vote. And so these things have kind of undermined this idea of not allowing a simple majority basically control our policies. Because you can be elected president without a majority of the vote. On top of that, through not constitutional change, but through legislation, we've given more and more and more power to the president, so he has more authority. And Congress, which is supposed to be the most dominant branch, has basically delegated their powers over to the president, so they have less authority. So we have like a system now where factions do rule, even though that was not what Madison wanted. Two main things have kind of undermined his idea and his design of the Constitution that have happened. One is gerrymandering, which now instead of us choosing our representatives, the representatives choose us. So they get to choose who they want to represent as opposed to us choosing who we want to represent us. And so that's the first thing. Although that's not a new thing, because the term gerrymander actually comes from Elbridge Gerry, who was at the Constitutional Convention. So it's been around forever, but since the 90s with GIS software, you can now do it with mathematical precision, because you can do it with census data, and you can pick your voters down to the block level, which wasn't before, you were just guessing. So that's the first thing that's kind of undermined. So Madison's thing about, you know, factions won't be able to find each other. The second thing that's undermined that is the development of media. And two things happened in the 80s. So the first was Reagan repealed the Fairness Doctrine. So the Fairness Doctrine basically stated that the news, when they gave you stories of national importance, they had to deliver it in an unbiased way, and they had to give you both sides. He repealed that, so they don't have to do that anymore. The second thing is we had the development of cable television and cable news. We have 24-hour news channels now. So now it's possible for us to like pick our news and pick it in a way that we never hear an argument or a story that we disagree with. So we're not actually being informed, we're just hearing things that are constantly reinforcing what we already think. And when you do that, you also start to think that your opinion is the majority opinion, even when it's not. You start to think that everybody thinks like you, even when they don't. And we shut out all diversity in opinions that don't agree with us because we think they're wrong, because we don't actually hear anything in what we choose for the news to help reinforce that. So what we have in the United States at an unrecord number is like this idea of tribalism and factions. In fact, if you look at Congress and how they vote, so we can measure like how divided Congress is by how many times people vote across the aisle. And so Congress is actually more divided today than they were on the eve of the actual Civil War. Meaning there was more cooperation between the two parties before they started killing each other than there is today. So we become that divided. The other thing, Will and I were talking about was this idea of, because we hear it all the time from the right, that this is a Christian nation, that our Constitution is a Christian constitution, that our founding fathers wanted to create a Christian nation. And there's just no evidence to support that. In fact, Christianity and the different sects of Christianity are some of the most dangerous factions to regime stability. So they wanted to control that. Jefferson talked about this wall of separation between church and state, and he talked about that in a letter, but there is some evidence of that in the Constitution even before you get to the First Amendment. And so in the Constitution, the only place where it talks about religion before the First Amendment is in the body of the text, in which they put, there shall be no religious test for any office. That means you can't like say that you have to be a Christian, or you have to be a Buddhist, or you have to be Hindu or anything in order to hold political office in the United States. That is strictly prohibited in the Constitution, even before we get to the First Amendment, which is an amendment, which means it was added afterwards, which allows for separation of church and state and freedom of religion. And it's not that the founding fathers were anti-religious, it's just that they thought that religion was such a personal thing that government should always stay completely out of it. And that if religion was going to ease its way into government, that would be done at the local level or even at the state level, because their populations were homogeneous. But because the nation as a whole was heterogeneous, you can't impose one particular religious belief on the entire nation, because that's just going to cause discord and possible civil war. I mean, you have to remember, in England, almost every war, you know, a lot of the wars were about religion. And so they wanted to keep that out of government. So I don't know where I'm at on my time. If anybody can tell me where I'm at on my time.
About 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I mean, because I talk really fast, sorry. And so I guess I'm pretty much done, but I would love to answer questions. I'm much better in a conversational, question answer period than I am just like talking.
Yeah, well, we appreciate your talk, and we're going to have some time for Q&A, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. We are back from our discussion break, and we're going to enter into some Q&A now with our speaker, Dr. Hughes. So if you'd like to ask a question, there's a few ways you could do it. You could obviously chat in the window, or if you have something you'd like to say, you can sort of wave your arm in your square here in Zoom, or use a reaction button to let me know that you have something that you'd like to ask. But let's see. Question from Eric on Facebook. By the election of 1800, he failed catastrophically to constrain factions, right? I think he's talking about Thomas Jefferson?
Madison.
Madison, okay. Yeah, so what's your response to that, Dr. Hughes?
Yes, I mean, it didn't work from the beginning. It's like it's beautiful on paper. I always say there's like this beautiful calculus to our Constitution on paper, but there's just so many things you can't take into account, human nature, right? So it never worked. He was trying really hard to build a consensus model, but what we have is a majoritarian model. And we know by comparing democracies that the most important variable in determining whether you have a consensus or majoritarian model is your electoral system. We have first past the post, winner take all. If you have first past the post electoral system, you're going to end up with a majoritarian model.
Mm-hmm. Question from Mary Jane on Facebook. Do we need a two-party system? That's a big question.
Do we need it? So I think to understand why we have a two-party system, I mean, because we can't just get rid of it. There are two things, like the main important thing that decides whether you have a two-party or multi-party system is your electoral system. So again, we have first past the post, which always gives you a majoritarian model, two-party system. And because we have a presidential system and not a parliamentary system, the presidency by nature is first past the post. You can only have one president. So we're basically going to always have a two-party system at the federal level. Now, you can have more than two parties at the lower levels, because like a lot of city councils have proportional systems. You could even have proportional for Congress, technically, although it would be difficult the way the Constitution is written. But two-party systems in general are considered good, because that in itself is supposed to be a moderating factor. Duverger's law says that two-party systems have more moderate politics than multi-party systems. He wrote that after World War II, and he was trying to explain how did democracy give us Hitler. So when Hitler was elected, the Weimar Republic, which was Germany at the time, was considered the most democratic country in the world. And they elected Hitler with like 30% of the vote. No one party had a majority. So extremist parties are easier for them to get elected in proportional systems and more difficult to get elected in two-party systems. But our parties aren't behaving naturally right now. And I think it may be because we're on the cusp of a critical election. We've had 4 critical elections in our entire history as the United States, so we're due one. A critical election would signal a generational realignment. And I think because we're on the verge of a critical election and the parties know this, they're not behaving appropriately.
Mm-hmm. That'd be nice to get some other voices in here. Does anybody have a video question or comment they'd like to ask?
I have a related question. What do you think of the Swiss presidential system, the multi-president system?
Oh, the constitutional monarchy?
No, the Swiss system where they have 5 presidents and they have a presidential council and they operate by consensus. So they're not technically one president, even though they have a president.
It's a consensus model, right? So like, I mean, I'm not really familiar with it, but I'm assuming there are 5 presidents basically serve as the government. So it's like similar as a cabinet. So in that sense, the president's just like the name that they're giving each cabinet. So I mean, that would be like a parliamentary system, which is what they have in most of Europe.
Okay.
Right.
And as a kind of a follow-up to that, Bob had asked, is there a country that has a favorite democratic system that you like? Which country?
Well, ours has lasted the longest. So, I mean, I think I would say until maybe 10 years ago, our system was my favorite because it's lasted the longest. But I think really a parliamentary, I mean, it's too late for us to go to that now, but a parliamentary system, I think, is much more responsive to the people. And that would basically be every European country, modern, that we think of like Germany, everything except for England, not England. But Norway, Denmark, all of those countries, I think have much better models than we do.
We have a few questions in the chat. Let's see. So someone had mentioned here, secularism is a fast growing religion, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of candidates that embrace that and they promote other religions. This may not be entirely in the wheelhouse of the talk, but as you have any comment on why none of the candidates seem to promote secularism. Instead, they tend to promote a particular religion.
Why don't candidates? I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, that is an interesting topic, though, and certainly something that...
yes, it is.
Yeah. Let's see. What was the idea of 3 co-equal branches from the very beginning, or was that something that was imposed later?
From the very beginning, because they copied the state. So this is our second constitution. We've had 2 constitutions. So under the first constitutional Articles of Confederation, each state was sovereign, and most states had 3 co-equal branches of government, and they just like copied that. So it just wasn't something imposed later. It's something from, they were copying the state governments. Our federal constitution looks very much like the Virginia state constitution at the time, and they just kind of copied it. Makes sense? They were all Virginians.
And I'm weaving a few questions in here, so apologize if I don't get to all of them. I just want to make sure we are fair to our Facebook audience too. Someone from Facebook had asked, was there a noticeable change in policy output when the vice president was the runner-up instead of the system we have now?
Okay, so this was the very first constitutional change that occurred. And so we only had 2 presidents where that was the case, George Washington and John Adams. So John Adams and Thomas Jefferson each represented 2 different factions. Jefferson had been the runner-up. Jefferson wasn't a Federalist. He was an anti-Federalist. He really didn't like our Constitution. And so because their relationship was so contentious, that they quickly amended the Constitution so the president and the vice president could work together, you know, and be of the same party after that. And so I wouldn't say there's a lot of policy differences between before Jefferson and after Jefferson, because we were so early in our history, and the federal government didn't have a lot of authority back then.
This was a discussion we had in our breakout room about sort of the gerrymandering in the districts. And so someone had asked, what about basing voting districts on census data to more accurately represent everyone? Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, I do. So, so the way that the districts are drawn is each state legislature draws the districts. So they do it after the census. So it is based on census data, by the way. That's why we do it every 10 years. So the most important election, I mean, I know the presidency is really important in November, but after that, you really have to pay attention to the state legislature, because the state legislature that we elect in Texas in November is going to determine the congressional districts for the next 10 years, because this is a census year. If you have an equal number of Republicans and Democrats in the legislature, you're less likely to have gerrymandered districts. If one party has an overwhelming majority, they're going to draw the districts so that they can hold on to that majority for the next 10 years. So you really want to pay attention to those down ballot races, the Texas legislature. And all 150 members of the House of Representatives in Texas are up for re-election.
Any other video comments or questions? Does anybody have any that they'd like to kind of weave in here just to get some other? I don't think I see. Oh, there we go. Let's see. Let's head over to Bob. All right, Bob, you're unmuted.
Yeah. Now I heard a slightly different question to the last question. I thought the question was, can't we use the census data to do the opposite of gerrymandering and draw the boundaries so that there is equal representative, so that it's more balanced by computer?
Okay, so the federal government can't draw the districts. The state legislatures draw the districts. There is a way for it to be more balanced. It's up to the states. There are actually 2 states that don't have gerrymandered districts because they've taken that out of the hands of the legislature. So in California, their districts are drawn up by a bipartisan committee of 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, 2 independents, and 2 citizens picked by lottery. In Arizona, they also have a bipartisan commission that draws those districts. But each state would have to pass a law to basically take it out of the legislature. Believe it or not, Texas was debating taking it out of the hands of the legislature and handing it over to commission, because the Republicans see that Texas is turning blue, and they're afraid that the Democrats, once they're in power, will then gerrymander the districts to their benefit, which they probably will. So they've actually had hearings debating on whether having an independent commission. Now, the 2 states that do have independent commissions, they did that by public referendum, bypassing the legislature. And in Texas, we don't have public referendum, so we can't bypass the legislature.
Man, that's interesting that they got motivated all of a sudden. I wonder why. to that note,
right,
somebody.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Oh, that tells me that Texas is closer to turning blue than even I thought, if they're thinking about changing this.
And regarding your thoughts on that, Richard had asked if you have any predictions on when Texas would turn blue.
A couple more election cycles to kind of give you an idea of how long it takes, because the incumbency rate is so strong. So Texas was a strong Democratic solid blue state for its entire history until the 80s. And in fact, there was several years where there was not one single Republican elected to any office in the state of Texas. In 1980s, the first time that Texas turned red, because they voted for Reagan. But it took till 2003 for the Republicans to flip the legislature. Because basically the incumbency rate is so strong, you have to wait till people retire or die. So it'll be a while.
And we had a few questions. It says, let's see, I think I'll use Ted's. It asks, some states are starting to divide electoral votes according to the percentage of the vote. What are the chances that this could convert our vote to popular vote?
Okay, so there's 2 states that already do that, Maine and Nebraska. So it's done proportionately. Of course, they don't have any electoral college votes. So basically it's done by each congressional district, right, gets an electoral vote. And then the 2 other electoral college votes for the Senate goes to the overall winner of the state, right? So it's more proportional. It's winner take most as opposed to winner take all. Texas actually debated doing this in the 1990s. They were going to move to proportional for electoral college. And then George W. Bush decided to run for president. And they backed off of that because they wanted to give him all of their electoral college votes. But the good news is there's nothing in the Constitution that says each state can't do that. So if each state does that, you would have fewer opportunities for you to have the popular vote and the electoral college vote to not line up, right? It's still going to be winner take most, but it's still not winner take all. So it's going to more likely line up more often than not. Each state legislature can do that. So lobby your state legislature. Tell them you want them to do that. By the way, our state legislature only meets every other year for 6 months.
It's a very short time to get on that.
Session. That's it, 6 months, every other year. So they will be in session starting in January of 2021, and will stay in session till June. And then you got to wait 18 months before you get another chance.
And I should mention, Michelle has encouraged everybody to fill out their census, which is good. You know, we talked about
Yes.
all that data being used for the districts and things of that nature. So it's important to do that. And let's see, any other video comments or questions? I should just make sure I'm seeing everybody. Okay, I think I am. All right. Well, hey, listen, we're getting some more questions here. I know we don't have time to get to all of them, guys. So thank you for submitting them both on Facebook and here in the Zoom. And then let's give a round of applause and jazz hands to Dr. Hughes for joining us today.